Welcome to Boston Jewish Now. I'm Jeremy Burton, and I'm joined by our producer, Ariel.
I want to talk about the American-Israeli relationship.
Yeah.
Where that is now, where you think it's going, or what that relationship even ought to look like.
Sure.
And there's a political lens, but also a personal lens here I think that maybe we should cover.
I think we also need to acknowledge that I think a lot of Israelis and a lot of supporters of the U.S.'s relationship were maybe surprised by, although they probably should not have been that surprised by, the various speeches and interviews by Vice President Vance were deeply disturbing. I don't think we've experienced, at least in recent memory, a time where the president and the vice president of the United States were so dismissive and so just directly degrading towards Israeli leaders, and frankly so threatening towards Israeli leaders in their public discourse, maybe in private, I don't know. And it's been frankly shocking to hear the way that this administration has talked about essentially a 180 almost pivot to oh, Iran is our friend. Iran should have the right to this and that and the other. It's disconcerting. And of course, that comes at the same time that we've seen all the things that we have in part named that are going on the left side of the aisle in the last week or two, which again are not new as well. And I think there are a couple of things here on the political level I just want to say, and then just sitting with this for now, and let's keep talking about this. One element of this that we need to acknowledge and name is that for Vice President Vance, I don't want to get into what he actually believes or doesn't believe, but I say this with some level of certainty. There's no way he would be saying and doing these things if he didn't believe that this behavior was part of his path to the presidency in 2028. And so whatever has been said about the turn against the U.S.-Israel relationship, the turn against, frankly, the U.S. as a responsible actor in the international arena amongst young conservatives and young conservative men. And the polling data clearly shows that there has been a significant turn against these things amongst young conservative men. The vice president is he's our first millennial vice president. And I don't think anybody would say he's not dialed in on what the mood is amongst millennial conservative men. He is very much dialed into that, and that is a world that he is very deeply in, and he's mapping out his path to the presidency. Obviously, he just released his new memoir, which I'm only partway through, so I'm not ready to discuss. But that should be a humongous red flag for those in our community who care deeply about the U.S.-Israel relationship, that he is choosing to say these things as someone with deep political ambitions. I think the second thing to take note of is the conversation that's probably going on amongst a lot of Israelis who are finding themselves stunned, surprised, including those who, frankly, the prime minister has been reassuring for the last decade that they did not need to have a bipartisan relationship with the United States. And let's just name it. Let's be explicit about it. The prime minister of Israel clearly made a choice over a decade ago that he believed that the long commitment that we as American Jews have had to bipartisan support for the U.S.-Israel relationship was not a strategic priority for his government. And you saw that with his appointment of a Republican political operative as ambassador to the United States back about 11 years ago. You saw that with the breach with the Obama administration and how they handled that. And he certainly reassured the Israeli public as well as the community here in the United States that Israel strategically would be fine with a partisan commitment to Israel
which
in
is
Washington.
Weakening.
Which we now see in the behavior of J.D. Vance, in the behavior of the president, in the polling on the millennial right, was a very bad bet. And that's on him. And I think the Israeli public is asking questions about that very bad bet. And that's their political conversation to have. But let's move beyond the politics. At a larger level, much is made on the left and on the right about the U.S.-Israel relationship and sort of like how much the U.S. is bound up in that relationship, quote unquote, beyond our interests. And I think there's some fallacy in that of the excessive attention that is given to that relationship when there are other international security relationships that the U.S. expends far more on. And we'll include in the show notes is a really great op-ed this week by Ariel Beery, who is an Israeli activist, thinker, and writer that I thought was a phenomenal piece. And I also want to plug his book, which I'll come back to in a second. But Ariel points out in this op-ed that there are other U.S. partners in the international community for whom we have far deeper commitments from a security point of view. There is no bilateral mutual defense agreement between the United States and Israel, for all that has been said. And yet, we have other partners, NATO. Obviously, the NATO countries, we have a mutual defense agreement. That includes Turkey, okay? Turkey, which has been the occupying power in northern Cyprus for a half a century now, since 1974. We have a mutual security agreement with them, for all the attention that gets paid to the American military financial aid that goes to Israel, which, by the way, is spent in the United States. Shockingly, we have spent far more supporting Ukraine, and I want to say rightly supporting Ukraine in the last 10 years than we have spent over the last 50 years supporting Israel. And yet there's an excessive attention on Israel. And the point is not to discuss that right now. Why that is so, I think regular listeners probably know what I think about why that is so. But I think there's also a conversation amongst Israelis about where their interests are. And that, to Ariel's point, he writes that it's probably time to admit that America's relationship with Israel was not a healthy one to begin with. And that maybe it's time to look elsewhere and to think differently about Israel's long-term interest in the international arena and not be quite so dependent on, whether it's rhetorically or factually, the U.S. government's consistency and reliability. And I say that's a decision for Israelis to make about their future. My view is that those of us as American Jews who are committed to the Israeli people as our brothers and sisters and cousins need to be in a space of supporting them about navigating their future. So if they make certain determinations about the reliability of America and go in other directions going forward, I think we should support that. That's the conversation they need to have. But what I will say as an American is I unfortunately understand that need to have that conversation at a time where my government, the American government, has proven itself to be a completely unreliable partner to all of its international allies. What we have done in breaking trust with our European allies, what we have done in breaking trust with Canada, what we have done in breaking trust with Denmark over this ridiculous rhetoric over Greenland. We're talking about countries that sent troops to Afghanistan in support of America after 9/11. I understand, and I want to affirm to Israelis as someone who cares passionately about their future, is I get why you are questioning your trust in American reliability, and I get why you may be making different decisions.
We say the people of Israel a lot. Supporting the American-Israel relationship is also supporting the idea of Israel, the promise of Israel, not just the people of Israel.
We don't talk about this enough, unfortunately, because we get too focused on talking about the political elements of the U.S.'s relationship. And I think, frankly, far too much energy has been expended in the American Jewish community over the last few decades talking about the politics of this. I think when we say that we are Zionists, when I say that I am a Zionist, when we as JCRC say that we are committed to Israel's future as a Jewish, secure, and democratic state, we are talking about an idea about what it is to be Jewish. And there are some, important and interesting and maybe not that interesting debates out there about what is it that is Jewish, what means to be Jewish at this moment. And I've written about this in the past, that Judaism is not a religion. We are a people. The idea of religion is understood in the Western world through the Christian lens is not the idea by which we understand our relationship to divine or faith or making sense of the universe in that way. But we are as a people. And what it means is we are people that are committed to the rest of our people, wherever they may be. And that might be in Ukraine, and that might be in the UK, and it might be in Toronto, as we discussed on our previous podcast. And it is most certainly this other largest Jewish community, which is the community in Israel. And our idea of peoplehood, when we say we are Zionists, also brings us to the place of we as a people have the same national rights as all other people. The national right to self-determination as a nation, the national right to autonomy and self-governance in, I'm going to say, at least part of our homeland. By the way, for us at JCRC, that belief in peoplehood and the national rights of people also brings us to the conclusion that the Palestinian people have national rights in a part of their homeland. And that is something for the Israeli and Palestinian people to figure out. But when we say our commitment is to the people as much as the state, it means we're not giving up on the people on the ground, whether they are literally our relatives or our metaphorical relatives, our beloved, our relationships that we hold with them, both Israeli Jews and Israeli citizens who are not Jewish, Palestinians, Druze, etc. And folks here know that I am on the board of American Friends of Givat Haviva, which works on with and for the full inclusion of Arab citizens of Israel and is co-led by Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians. But your point raises up something, I mentioned Ariel Beery, his recent book, which is called Being Israeli After the Destruction of Gaza. And I think it's a phenomenal book. I think everyone should be reading it. And the reason I think everybody should be reading it is because way too much of the discussion in the United States about Israel and Palestine is in the context of politics and outcomes that should be imposed or outcomes that we in the Western world want to see there without any listening to the actual people on the ground who live there and what they want and what they aspire to. And Ariel's book, which is essentially a series of interviews with other Israeli Jews, and he's very explicit about this. He names it in the foreword that there need to be other books written to lift up more voices, say, of Israeli Palestinians or of Palestinians who are not Israeli and of Israelis who are not liberal. He wrote this book specifically to lift up the voices of liberal Israelis. And that is a voice, or those are voices that we don't do enough to listen to in the West, that we don't do enough to listen to in this country. And I think it's worth listening to them. And I draw inspiration from their fortitude in being committed to what we'll call capital L liberal values. By the way, values that are expressed in Israel's Declaration of Statehood. Their commitment to not shying away from and looking with clear and sometimes greatly pained eyes at the conflict, at some of the uglier parts of Israeli society, at some of the uglier parts of what has happened in Gaza over the last couple of years. And they're not shy about it, and they're honest about it in this book. And they still have hope for Israel's future. And as we have discussed so many times, including on our last podcast, hope requires action. And these are folks who are committed to action. And I think if we're serious, not just about geopolitical, political theory, rhetoric, discourse, blah, 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 Western, ugly American attitudes about relating to the world through our own prism and lens, then we also have to be serious about listening to and lifting up the voices of people on the ground, people who live there, people who are not going away, and people who have to live with the consequences of decisions that are being made. And these are the people who are right now in the last week or two grappling with what it means to live with the decisions that are being made far away, not by their government, but by the U.S. government with the Iranian government and maybe the Qatari government and the Pakistani government without the Israelis in the room. And they're the people who have to keep hoping and working for a better future for everyone who lives in that land, both Israeli and Palestinian. And they inspire me for their fortitude, and they're willing to do that. And that's not about politics. That is about human condition. I think there's much more of these Israelis that are given voice in the Western media. And people love, the media loves how our social media is designed for the polarizing conversation. People who are doing hard, complex work, holding fraught relationships, willing to work across difference, are not the people whose stories lead. And that's why I think this book, Being Israeli After the Destruction of Gaza, is frankly one of the most important books about and by Israelis that has been written since October 7th.
If you had to give a message to the kinds of folks who say, oh, you're a Zionist or you support Israel, you must be aligned with Bibi and Ben Gvir, and you have to call it a genocide or whatever. Like, what do you say to those kinds of folks?
First of all,
and what do you point them to?
First of all, I think that kind of rhetoric is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
Being a Zionist, which means being a supporter of the right of the Jewish people to national determination in a part of our homeland. Being a Zionist does not require me to support a politician or another politician, or to oppose a politician or another politician. Prime Minister Netanyahu, at the end of the day, he is a politician, whether you think he's good or bad. And I don't think he's particularly good. I mean, he's an excellent politician, but I don't think he's been a particularly good prime minister. And I certainly don't agree with him on a lot of things. That my support for a government does not have anything to do with my commitment to Zionism as a part of my Jewish commitments, any more than my support for a particular government of the United States in any way informs or impacts my commitment to the American project. I am a patriot of this country. Members of my family have served in the American military, and I say that proudly. The flag that my grandfather received upon his death for his service in the Navy sits in my living room. My pride as an American, my pride in what they have fought for, my pride in what we fight for every day has nothing to do with whether I support or oppose any politician or government. And the use of certain rhetoric words, I think the fact that people jumped to calling it a genocide as quickly as October 8th before Israel had even begun to respond meant that it was never about the facts of genocide. It was always about the politics of demonizing Israel as a state and demonizing Israelis as a people, and frankly demonizing Jews as Jews, and was never about being serious about the facts. That doesn't mean I'm oblivious. It doesn't mean I think everything that happened, everything that the Israeli military did in Gaza was okay. Do I think there's a real probability even of war crimes? Sure. But I think people use rhetoric to a point and a purpose, which is to do harm. And the rhetoric around genocide has been as much about declaring Jews outside the circle of goodness and outside the circle of decent humanity than it has ever been about being serious about solving the problem. And the problem is, at the end of the day, before the war and after the war, you have a whole heck of a lot of people living in one sliver of land who are going to need to find a way to see each other's humanity and to see each other's dignity and share that land in whatever political outcome they decide on, not us.